We're in Kotte, one of Sri Lanka's ancient ruined cities. It lies on the outskirts of modern Colombo. It's hard now to picture the bustling civilization that once flourished here. But that's the sort of reconstruction that archaeologists try to do. They spend their lives searching for keys to the past. And perhaps one of their greatest challenges is in Laos.
The fabulous temples and golden statues of Vientiane hide an even greater treasure. For Tongsa Sayavongkamdi, a journey to the strangest place in Indochina begins with this jar.
The Plain of Jars is a large area where thousands of jars have been lying there for more than 2,000 years now. And no one knows exactly who made them, why they were made. And there are a lot of mysterious things about these jars.
Tongsa is the top archaeologist of Laos, in charge of the first modern survey of the jars. They lie far away in the remote north.
During the American intervention from 64 to 70, the Plain of Jars have been heavily air-bombed. The countryside is covered with craters.
The town of Pong Savan is the nearest settlement to the plain. To the local people, the jars are just part of the landscape. The jars are scattered over 600 square miles.
In the province of Siang Quang, there are about 20 sites where there are jars. But this site is the biggest. It is called Ban Ang. There are more than 250 jars in this site. The jars here in Ban Ang are made of sandstone, but in other sites they are made of quartz. But the interesting thing is that this rock is not available around the sites.
In the 1930s, a pioneering study was undertaken by French archaeologist Madeleine Kalani. An intrepid traveller, she made 3 expeditions to Laos. She counted, measured and mapped the jars, but never managed to uncover all of their secrets. She could find no trace of where the jar builders lived.
The shape is also very interesting because it's not a regular shape. You can't roll a jar. It won't be easy to roll a jar. It's irregular. There is a large variety of shapes too. All of them are different.
Helped by local state archaeologists, Tongsa begins his fieldwork by checking Kalani's findings. At 10 feet in height, this proves to be the largest jar of all. Tongsa finds more questions than answers.
In this site, we have found 1 lid. But why only 1 lid when we have 250 jars? And the shape, the size, don't fit to any of the jars. So another theory said that it might be an offering table rather than a lid.
At the nearby mineral water bottling plant, local entrepreneurs are tapping the jar's commercial potential. Legend says that the jars were vats for rice wine at a party held by a Chinese warlord to celebrate a victory in battle. Other stories say they were cocktail glasses for giants. But Tongsa thinks that Madeleine Kalani had the best idea.
My feeling is that this site is funeral site. It's a graveyard. There is a large cave with 2 man-made openings on its roof. And there is a theory which I support, suggesting that It used to be a crematorium, and remains were kept in the jars. And we'll have to look for these remains. The Plain of Jars, it's unique of its kind. It's very valuable cultural site. It's a place full of mysteries and questions, and we are just trying to find the answers to them.
What an extraordinary place. I wonder if the people of the future will be as puzzled by the bomb craters as we are by the jars. The only thing that would clear up this frustrating mystery would be some kind of a written document explaining why people created it. And that's very unlikely now. But sometimes archaeologists do find surprising answers, often against most formidable odds.
This steamy inland waterway in South Carolina has not always been navigable by boat. Underwater archaeologist Mark Newell has studied the canal's history. Although heavily used in the 1800s, it silted up and almost vanished in later years. During works to clear it, Mark and his team made a remarkable find in the mud.
There was a bed of sediment in the canal. We were excavating and sifting that through screens. And I was standing there watching the material coming out of the screen when this suddenly popped into the screen. On careful examination, you can very readily see that the chips that were taken from the stone were very carefully chipped off. This was no accidental manufacture. And when you see that kind of care taken in creating a stone shape, then you realize you have a tool, a stone tool of some kind.
It fitted so neatly into the palm of his hand that Newell was convinced he was holding a hand axe once used by Neanderthal man.
The first immediate question was, how could it be here? I checked with various experts and immediately established that it definitely wasn't a South Carolina tool, and from the general shape it was thought that it was very similar to European ancient tools. So we began to examine that possibility.
The trail led him to the British Museum and its vast storeroom of Stone Age implements.
Oh, jolly good. What have we got here? Oh, yes.
The boxes contain specimens of every type of prehistoric tool.
Yeah, so those contrast nice. Thank you.
Jill Cook has years of experience in identifying and dating them.
Mark Newell turned up on the doorstep one afternoon in 1989, opened the box and said, "Have you ever seen anything like this before?" And I said, "Well, no, not from South Carolina, but certainly from Europe."
Jill Cook recognised telltale markings that told her the axe was carved over 200,000 years ago. She suspected it came from France.
I advised Mark to take it to a geologist who would be able to identify all the little microorganisms in the raw material which will indicate where the flint might have come from. With the results of the geological analysis, we know that this little chap must have come from southwest France, the hinterland of Bordeaux, where it would have been made about 350,000 years ago. Our problem is, how did it end up in South Carolina in the 18th century?
The trail led back to Charleston. The search for clues took Mark Newell to the city's private library.
I'd like to see copies of the South Carolina Gazette for 1824.
1824. Just a moment, please.
I'll be at the table over there. Thank you.
In existence since colonial days, the Library Society is the repository of local historical knowledge. Newell's hunch was that the answer lay in newspaper reports of a tragedy on the Santee Canal where the axe was found.
The Gazette, 1824. We do ask to be very careful. The pages are brittle, and so they tend to tear or flake easily. And if there's anything else you need, just ask.
Thanks, Lynn. One of the most interesting items we found was this report right here in the Gazette of Saturday, May 22nd, 1824. And it's an account of how a canal boat belonging to a Mr. Sailor of Charleston blew up in the Santee Canal when its cargo of vitriol and gunpowder mixed. And that began to give us an explanation or some clues as to how the stone might have ended up in the canal.
The small vessels that plied the canal in those days carried rocks and stones as ballast. Often this came from ocean ports, dumped by ships from Europe after taking on new cargo.
When the boat blew up, the explosion scattered the entire contents, cargo and ballast rock, throughout the canal. Plus, the canal boat would have been dragged through the canal to clear it after the accident, again depositing its contents along the length of the canal in which our excavations took place. For a 250,000-year-old Neanderthal chopper core to be transported from somewhere near the port of Bordeaux to Charleston, and from Charleston into the Santee Canal, and then to be discovered that many years later is pretty phenomenal.
Off the coast of California, these divers know that beneath the waters of the Pacific, they will find puzzling archaeological treasures.
Dive, dive, dive.
In 1975, skipper Bob Meistrel retrieved a strange stone from the ocean floor. A hole had been drilled clean through it. The divers are looking for some more.
Bob, I've located the stone. We need the line to tie it off with now.
The stones had obviously been carved deliberately. Experts recognized an uncanny resemblance to anchors used by fishermen in old China.
Well, I don't think they're local because who would ever make a stone anchor when we had steel? You know, steel anchors have been around for years and years and years. I mean, it's quite a project to drill that hole through that rock. You take it into a guy that cuts cement pilings and stuff and ask him to drill a hole in that rock. You're going to pay me a lot of money.
Get out of the way from it, Wayne. Hang on to it. Hang on to it as tight as you can. Why don't you, Chris, can you come up here?
Okay, we got it.
Meistrel thinks American history should be rewritten.
If we can confirm that these are from China or from a different part of the world and that they've been here a long, long time, then we can definitely say that Columbus didn't discover America, somebody else did.
Each mark is 50 pounds. There we go.
Okay, go up.
Not everybody agrees. The first stone that Bob recovered was examined by Professor Frank Frost.
I took a small piece of the stone to the geology department at UC Santa Barbara, and a specialist there in sedimentary rock tested it and told me that it was Monterey Shale, which is the most common rock formation all along the coast here in Southern California. The first question was answered, and that is that whoever made them here out of local rock.
Frost discovered that Palos Verdes, beside where the stones were found, had once been a fishing village for Chinese immigrants.
We discovered that the Chinese living here in the 19th century had used stone anchors in their fishing industry. This answered at least part of the question. The possibility then, the greatest possibility, was that these were made by Chinese fishermen here in the 19th century.
Frost's explanation of the anchor's origins pours cold water on the idea that the Chinese beat Columbus to America.
On Columbus Day, regularly, there used to be a little sidebar in the paper saying, "But was Columbus first?" And then there would be all sorts of speculation about Orientals or Egyptians or Hittites or whatever. But no, to my way of thinking, there is no evidence for a pre-Columbian discovery of America.
Another riddle lifted from the seabed has taken 60 years to solve. These are ivory tusks. They're under investigation by underwater geologist David Long. Long has a favourite theory that the North Sea was once dry land and home to prehistoric animals. He read in the Times of 1934 that 2 ivory tusks had been hauled in the nets of a fishing vessel off the Shetland Islands. Professor Ritchie of Aberdeen University declared they had come from a mammoth. The owners of the fishing vessel were delighted with the publicity this brought to their fish shops. David Long was curious to know if the story was true.
So I took measurements and photographed them, and I then went off and tried to look at other mammoth tusks in various museums and realised these weren't quite the same thing.
Long used a known mammoth tusk for comparison.
The way one can distinguish between mammoth tusks and the elephants is that a mammoth tusk is curved in 2 planes. If you can see the big curve here, but there's also another curve underneath here if I rotate it. And that the tusk is turning slightly. Whereas these 2 tusks here are actually just curved in 1 plane. They're quite flat here on the bench, but just curved like that. Immediately I began to realise they're quite different.
He got permission to take a small sample of the ivory for carbon-14 dating. He sent it to Oxford University.
They analysed it and wrote back that we came with a date of about 290 years old, plus or minus about 100 years, and they cannot be mammoths. They must be from modern elephants. Now, what were they doing east of Shetland?
The shipping records of 1689 gave Long his answer. War in the English Channel caused ships to divert around northern Britain. Hidden in archives in Holland, he found the papers relating to a convoy of 4 Dutch traders. These had foundered and sunk in a storm.
The 4th ship, which was the Wapen van Alkmaar, had actually set sail from what's called Sri Lanka these days. And that was well known as the major ivory exporting from the Indian subcontinent, that most ivory came out of that area. And that ship is recorded as having been lost to the east of Shetland. My feeling is that that is probably the most likely vessel from which these elephant tusks have come from, that they are modern elephant tusks brought by a ship, not a mammoth which happened to be wandering around on the North Sea 50,000 years ago.
The solutions to the mysteries of the Chinese anchors and the Scottish tusks are intriguing and ingenious, but they won't change our view of the past. For archaeologists, the greatest prize is a discovery which gives a real insight into the thinking of extinct civilizations. One rare example of this came after centuries of research into the great temples of the ancient Greeks. An enormous amount is known about them, but what happened to the architect's blueprints?
The Temple of Didyma in Turkey was built in honour of Apollo. The god of light, art and prophecy was said to have been conceived under a nearby laurel tree. For generations, tourists and archaeologists have been awed by the building's staggering beauty. German researcher Lothar Hasselberger has been studying the building since he first came here in 1979.
The architect, he was just genius, the amount of refinement that boils down here in fractions of inches. And it's just a tiny detail of this giant building, and this created this beauty that we are still amazed of.
Lothar learned the temple's history, but no one knew how the architects had planned it, until he took a walk amongst the ruins one afternoon.
I was here one day just wandering around and looking at the wonderful and unparalleled construction. And all of a sudden I realized, my goodness, there are incised lines that all of a sudden melt together into quarter circle and semicircles and yet another sequence of quarter circles, exactly the way they are executed out in the temple. It showed up in such a brilliance and clarity that I had no doubts these are the one-to-one scale drawings of the construction plans for this very temple.
To check his discovery, Lothar used mirrors to throw light onto the faint scratchings. He had found the blueprint for the columns.
What we are looking at here, the outline, the bent outline of the shaft that towards the bottom of the column ends in a profile, the quarter circle of which I'm following. And after a little step, it ends in a semicircular profile where we can actually see even the center points for inserting the pair of dividers.
Lothar drew out the plans. He found that the architects had altered their workings, but they were a perfect match for the finished pillars. An accident of history had given Lothar this chance of a lifetime discovery.
I was able to find these drawings because the temple was left unfinished at the end of antiquity. These drawings were, of course, meant to be taken away, erased again. This, however, didn't happen because the temple as a whole wasn't finished, and it's due to that we are able to stand in front of unfinished walls bearing the entire set of full-scale plans as if standing in the architect's design office, left by the people just going out for lunch, and we are able to look over their shoulders.
Lothar examined every inch of the walls with meticulous care. He found horizontal lines representing the column shafts.
It's impossible to assume that the ancient master builders were exposed to this cumbersome procedure of reading their own plans. By looking more closely along the wall surfaces, I discovered in certain areas traces of reddish mineral pigments. And to cut a long story short, the entire wall surface intended for the drawings was covered with this reddish iron oxide. And I must say they stand up quite clearly against the reddish background. After having understood what I have seen, one thing was clear to me. This is a much more general answer than just resolving the design of this very temple. It's, on the whole, the answer of how Greek buildings had been designed.
Well, the moral of these stories is this. Apparently insoluble mysteries may turn out to have simple solutions. But one thing is clear, the key to unlocking the past that you can't do without is good old-fashioned love.